a message about that coming up. The other thing to say is we're very happy for you to tweet anything out about this seminar. In fact, we would encourage it because I think it will help more people find their way to our speaker's new book that she's going to talk about today. And if you're doing that, please do tag either Jessica in at JT_signs and the seminar series, which is at UOE CJS. And without further ado, I will take down the holding slide and hand over to my colleague, Susan.
That's great. Thank you very much, Andy. It's my great pleasure to welcome Jessica Symes as our speaker for today's Crime, Justice and Society seminar. So thank you so much for joining us, Jessica. We really appreciate you giving us your time. Jessica is Assistant Professor of Sociology at Boston University, where she's an affiliate of the Centre for Social Science Innovation and also holds a position in the Faculty of Computing and Data Sciences. Jessica's substantive areas of expertise bring together mass imprisonment in the US context with a multitude of issues and challenges relating to race, ethnicity and immigration. And not only does she apply herself to this study of this critical disciplinary area within her academic work, but she also holds important civic roles within the community of Massachusetts, including working with a prisoner re-entry programme, the Thrive Communities programme. In addition to her forthcoming book, Punishing Places, The Geography of Mass Imprisonment, which she'll talk to us about today, she has an impressive array of published articles and many others under review, including several with Bruce Western from Columbia University, who I know will be familiar to many members of our audience following his visit to Scotland in 2018. Jessica has presented widely on her book during its development, and I don't know, possibly the pandemic has helped with that a little bit. I'm delighted that as of the 26th of October, last Tuesday, it's available to purchase from Amazon UK and also a range of other outlets for a very modest amount of around £22. And unfortunately, I didn't manage to read it in advance of today, but I have read her paper in the Journal of Quantitative Criminology from a few years ago, and I've read an extract from the introduction, and I'm struck by three very key things about Jessica's work. Firstly, she writes in an extremely accessible way, and I am certain that her book will appeal to a very broad audience, including and not restricted to academics. Secondly, Jessica approaches the study of mass carceral punishment from a geographical perspective, which typically lends itself to some very quite traditional and established methodological approaches, things like spatial regression, GIS and autocorrelation. And she look and typically focus on large urban centres. However, Jessica's work introduces some quite novel measures for measuring community level effects of mass incarceration using spatial and quantitative and qualitative methods, and she extends her analytical reach to some of these hidden suburban and smaller municipalities in which inequalities can become concentrated. As she describes it, it's an institution unconstrained by city boundaries. And thirdly, criminologists have tended to deal separately with issues of inequality as they relate to people and place, whereas Jessica's work adeptly brings these together in ways that highlight the big picture of the geography of imprisonment in a way that she doesn't forget to remind us what that means both at a community and an individual level. And I think it's easy for human stories to get lost in the world of big data analytics, and for that to be an inherent criticism against those of us who do that type of work. So it's really refreshing to see scholarship that breaks down those barriers. Jessica's going to speak for around about 45 minutes, leaving us with about the same amount of time for questions. Do put in the chat if you've got a question. It'd be nice to hear voices, so you can raise a hand towards the end of the presentation if you've got a question, or indicate in the chat that you have a question that you'd like to ask, or if you're really shy and retiring, you can put your question in the chat, and we'll deal with all of those after Jessica's given her presentation. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Jessica, to start your presentation whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that very, very generous introduction. I feel so warmly welcomed to this wonderful seminar. And this is officially my first talk since the book published last week. So it feels very, just such a beautiful group to get to chat with. And I will get started. My slides, I hope, are showing up fine, so I can get started. Okay, great. Wonderfully for this audience, I don't think it'll be a surprise to see what chart I'm about to present. So of course, in the late 20th century, the United States embarked on an experiment in crime control policy that was both globally unique and historically unprecedented. After several decades of stability in the early 20th century, up to about 1970, the rate of incarceration more than quadrupled. By 2012, the incarceration rate in the US was about 700 per 100,000, with a total of 2.23 million people in custody. And about 1 in 3 adults had felony records. And demographers think this is 70 to 100 million people. Nearly 1 in every 100 adults currently resides in prison or jail in the US. Of course, this is also, as I said, globally unique. The United States incarcerates more people than any other nation in the world. And when compared to other nations, the United States incarcerates people 5 to 10 times higher than we see rates in Western European countries and other liberal democracies. This scale of the prison system, though, is not the only aspect of it that really is a defining feature. Racial disparity is also a very defining feature of the American system of punishment. Over 2 million people, of the over 2 million people behind bars, 60% are people of color. For African American men born in 2001, the lifetime risk of imprisonment is 1 in 3. And for those who dropped out of high school, nearly 70% have prison records. These men are more likely to be incarcerated than employed in the labor market. And I just want to add to this racial disparity figure, a recent study that will be coming out next month in Science Advances that I wrote with Bruce Western and a graduate student named Hannah Pullen-Blasnick. We find that 1 in 12 Black men experience solitary confinement by the age of 32. So it's not just that racial disparity is a fundamental feature of the system of punishment, but American prisons are very harsh, much harsher on any sort of metrics. And one way we can measure that is with solitary confinement. And the exposure of solitary confinement among African American men is, in our opinion, astronomical. So 1 in 12, 12% of Black men will experience solitary. So these two facets of the US criminal justice system, its scale and its large racial disparity, have led to what scholars have termed mass imprisonment, where, as David Garland says, imprisonment ceases to be the incarceration of an individual offender and becomes the systematic imprisonment of whole groups of the population. So my work is to take into consideration how that fact of whole groups of the population is fundamentally geographically patterned. The spatial processes and place-based social contexts produce places and neighborhoods with differential levels of imprisonment. So this is how I define what I call the spatial context of imprisonment. It takes into account the spatial scale and diffusion and clustering of punishment in communities. It also considers context and place-based characteristics, including things like concentrated disadvantage, rates of crime, racial segregation, to produce differential levels of imprisonment at the place level. The spatial, and how I measure that in this study is the spatial concentration of the prior residences of incarcerated people. So when we contextualize mass incarceration, we're saying that we know, at least in the sort of system of American residential life, that life chances are highly spatially organized by a pattern of race and socioeconomic status. We also know that mass imprisonment has become a significant aspect of cities and poor communities. We also know that policing and court processing and community supervision are all organized by an intense pattern of geography. We talk about precincts and districts. Police go to blocks and sort of organize their routine activities around a spatial logic. And so the spatial concentration of punishment emerges from these sort of conditions, and in turn reproduce the conditions of our American racialized communities. Oops. So the main arguments of punishing places, which is the name of my book that just was published last week, is that mass incarceration is a broad mode of governance affecting communities across the US urban and rural continuum. And this is actually historically new. It was true that incarceration rates, especially in the 1970s and 80s and even into the 1990s, were very much concentrated in America's largest cities. But over the last 25 years, this pattern has spatially diffused across urban, suburban, small cities, and rural communities. I also argue that despite this sort of spatial diffusion across large areas of American geography, that mass incarceration should be conceptualized as one of the legacies of racial residential segregation. And I'll talk about this point quite a bit in this talk. Finally, an analysis of the community level conditions of mass imprisonment, as opposed to, say, the individual level consequences or even the family consequences. But thinking about the community points to really broader understandings of both the causes and consequences of mass imprisonment, and in particular, the political and social costs of mass imprisonment. So what this analysis brought me to was kind of three key findings. This broad spatial pattern really affecting today small cities and counties. I also find that while the pattern has spatially diffused, there's some deep stickiness about where mass incarceration still matters in these sort of what I call communities of pervasive punishment. And then finally, I explore, and this is maybe a little bit more unusual than the typical quantitative work, is I explore ways of directly measuring our normative commitments to things like membership in society, inclusion, and the sort of basic principles of justice, and trying to develop actual measures of our failings in terms of our normative commitments. And so I'll talk about one of those measures towards the end of the talk. I'm going to focus on these two main points today. So just to give you a roadmap for the rest of the talk, I'm going to provide a brief background and justification for studying a lot of this work in Massachusetts. I'm going to detail the theoretical framework that motivates these analyses and discuss the data collection. So much of this research is really built on a very unique set of data that I was able to access. I'll share two key findings from my book, and I'll conclude with a summary of this work's contributions to theory and policy. And for the next few minutes, I'm going to share information about the main research site of Massachusetts to provide some background on the broader motivation for the work. So when I was a second-year graduate student, I answered a job posting for an unpaid internship at the Massachusetts Department of Corrections Research Division. I'm often asked how I got access to geographic data on prison admissions, and I think it's really useful for anyone interested in collecting data for a thesis or dissertation to consider kind of creative ways for accessing data. This is the prison in which there is a research division sort of office. It's located in Concord, Massachusetts, very sort of famous colonial town. And this is formerly the warden's house, which became the research division of the Massachusetts Department of Corrections. Like much of the rest of the country, Massachusetts enacted a series of tough on crime policies, including truth in sentencing, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes laws. In 2018, though, Massachusetts voters overwhelmingly supported a bill to decriminalize cannabis, and the state legislature passed comprehensive criminal justice reform, which brought significant reforms on areas as broad as juvenile justice, bail reform, increased funding for diversion programs, expanding expungement, even solitary confinement reform, and the elimination of mandatory minimums for low-level drug offenses. So despite these punitive policies, Massachusetts has the lowest incarceration rate in the country, the 50th in terms of overall rate. But in global perspective, Massachusetts still has an incarceration rate that is markedly above historical and comparative norms for a society of this type. Another interesting sort of feature of Massachusetts is the racial disparities are much higher than national levels. The Black-white ratio of imprisonment in Massachusetts was 7.5 compared to a national Black-white ratio of 5.1. And so this value means that Black people are 5 times more likely than white people to be in prison. In Massachusetts, it's a factor of almost 8. And Massachusetts also has the dubious honor of having the highest Latino-white ratio in the country. Massachusetts rate is over 3 times the national level. So this case of sort of what we might argue is like the best case scenario in the United States for the smallest carceral footprint is also an interesting case in terms of how very high disparities and fundamentally very high levels of inequality in the state. I think these 2 facets actually offer a really important window into the challenges of addressing social inequality, even in the context of a progressive state with comparably robust and high quality welfare, healthcare, and education systems. So next I'm going to talk about kind of the main theoretical underpinnings of this work and what sort of inspired thinking about punishment as a contextual condition of places. Early work by sociologists, beginning with W.E.B. Du Bois, have long explored the racial spatial divide in harmful community exposures and the fundamentally different social environments of white, Black, and Latino groups in the United States. So for instance, William Julius Wilson wrote about the conditions of poverty, saying, simple comparisons between poor whites and poor Blacks would be confounded with the very fact that poor whites reside in areas which are ecologically and economically very different from poor Blacks. Another group of scholars explored this very issue, but in the context of exposure to criminalized violence, stating, in this racialized reality, whites, African Americans, Latinos, and others are highly segregated from one another in settings where social and economic circumstances are rarely comparable. So this poses both a methodological challenge, but also, I think, a methodological finding in and of itself. What are the relevant comparison groups when we're considering this sort of level of confounding, where the racialized sort of nature of the distribution of advantages and disadvantages is so confounding to these other aspects of community life, like violence and poverty? And for these scholars and myself, durable disadvantages in place are structuring these observed differences in poverty and crime. But to date, incarceration rates hadn't really been conceptualized this way. So this is a figure that comes from my book, where I'm exploring violent crime and poverty in neighborhoods, comparing that to the disparities we see in punishment. So on average, Black and Latino neighborhoods have a reported violent crime rate of 54 to 64% higher than the average white neighborhood. So the dashed line at 1 would indicate sort of no disparity between white neighborhoods and Latino, anything below that line. So it's about 50% higher on average compared to the white neighborhoods. When we move over to poverty, sort of William Julius Wilson's argument, there's greater disparities. And here I'm looking at child poverty in particular. And on average, Black neighborhoods have 2.7 times higher poverty, and Latino neighborhoods have over 3 times higher child poverty than white neighborhoods. But the greatest disparities are apparent in prison admissions, where we see that the prison admission rate in Massachusetts in Black and Latino neighborhoods is over 4 times higher than in the average white neighborhood. It's about 4.5 times higher. So how have we explained racial disparity? If we're really interested in sort of thinking about prison admissions as a contextual factor within communities, we've really actually, as a discipline and as a field, have focused on really 2 explanations. They've really favored explaining racial disparity in terms of national or state level policy relating to welfare or crime policy, or have drilled down to individuals and focused on how racial bias and discrimination and individual decision-making among, say, court actors or police officers or even prison officials have yielded these differential experiences for Black and white and Latino groups. So these macro level forces argue that, these scholars of the macro side say disparities follow from a long line of historical conditions of racial caste, and also that punitive policies, particularly the war on drugs, heap the harshest penalties on the most vulnerable populations, and they were particularly racialized policies. The individual bias perspective focuses on disparities that follow from discrimination, bias, and racism that emerge at the discretionary stages of the criminal justice system. And so what I think is that there's this really big missing link, that the spatial context is important above and beyond individual level bias or punitive policy. And that that biases are both producing the racial organization of criminal justice activity, as well as being reinforced by that spatial structure, and that national or state level policy has really built its arguments around sort of dangerous cities and controlling the cities, and that the city itself became such an important metaphor for disorder and violence. And controlling cities became a massive policy instrument for politicians and elected officials. So I argue that racialization is a master mechanism producing both racial segregation and a broad array of punitive racial projects aimed at marginalized communities. So the sort of missing parts, why this is really important, is that a national policy focus obscures how a very small number of places contribute the lion's share of incarcerated populations. When we look at state level differences in incarceration rates, for example, we focus on how that might be driven by state level policy, we miss the sort of localized experience of punishment. So this work, my work, incorporates a spatial analysis to provide some insight into how criminal justice policies are enacted across and within communities. And also, as I'll demonstrate soon, the severity of racial inequality. In particular, how we could think about that racial inequality really preceding arrest and conviction. People are living already in communities that are so disadvantaged and so highly policed that there is a deep severity of racial inequality that emerges even before our measures of arrest and conviction come into play. Now, the individual bias perspective, which has been, really the focus of the psychological literature or even policy literature, where can we intervene? At what point is discretion or discrimination really emergent? A lot of times our studies of racial bias in decision-making by line officers and prosecutors and sentencing judges can find little evidence of racial disparity, leading to an erroneous conclusion that racial bias is not a fundamental feature of the US criminal justice system. So by bringing in the neighborhood and the community, we actually can demonstrate how racial disparities are both cumulative and contextual across different stages of the criminal justice process. So what I will be talking about in terms of my main results today is sort of communities of pervasive punishment, where a community where incarceration has become a fundamental dynamic due to the extreme level of the spatial concentration of prison admissions. It can hollow out populations, it can disrupt families and neighbors from engaging one another, that it's sort of this fundamental feature of the neighborhood, much like the scholars before me who've looked at criminalized violence and poverty. And the way that I formalize this in the book is I look at statistically significant levels of spatial clustering of prison admissions at the tract level. And I guess in fundamental sort of summary, the spatially organized criminal justice patterns map onto this racial spatial divide in American communities. And I will show that neighborhoods with distinct ethno-racial compositions are vulnerable to the greatest surveillance and harshest treatment by criminal justice authorities. So I want to briefly give you a sense of the data that I'm working with to make these arguments. I want to say first that this study was really actually inspired by a group of incarcerated men who had conducted their own study called the 7 Neighborhoods Study. So they were incarcerated in a prison in New York State. And they decided to start asking people, what neighborhood were you from? And this was taking place in the late 1970s, 80s. And they found that about 70% of New York State's prison admissions came from just 7 neighborhoods in New York City. And that spatial concentration was so profound. And the leader of this sort of group of incarcerated research scientists was a fellow named Eddie Ellis, who conducted a neighborhood study of incarceration. And to me, this is just such a brilliant innovation and really what came to inspire my work. And to get into kind of the nitty gritty, Massachusetts, when a person comes into their custody, conducts a battery of questions. And one of the questions they ask is, what was your last known address? And they ask this question really sort of reliably and enter in the address, the actual address, the city, and the state. If an individual was living in a shelter, they would enter the name of the shelter, the address of the shelter, and they put this information into their system. And during that unpaid internship, I discovered that this data existed. And I did a quick tabulation of the zip codes, thinking I would see, much like Eddie Ellis, most of those zip codes being in Boston. And what I found was that they're actually from all over the state, and a huge majority actually were not from Boston, our largest city. So the intake records have the last known address. They also contain all sorts of demographic information, such as their race and ethnicity, their gender, age, marital status, their legal status, if they were born in the US or not, offense type, and sentence length. These counts, which I geocoded using the address data, were aggregated to census tracts, cities, and counties, which produced a prison admission cohort, especially at the address level, from 2009 to 2017, and about 21,000 prison admissions during the period of this, this study. This amounts to about 6 prison admissions every day. The neighborhood data comes from the American Community Survey, which has data on, of course, the socioeconomic level of socioeconomic disadvantage, racial composition, residential instability. Now, crime data is actually quite hard to get at the local level. And typically what we use in the US is the FBI Uniform Crime Reports, which is at the municipal level and has, poor coverage in a lot of areas, especially small cities. But the Massachusetts State Police actually collects data from NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, at the XY coordinate, so they provided that data to me for 76% of the state. But Boston was not part of the NIBRS reporting system. So I had to also contact Boston Police Department to obtain tract level data on violent crime and drug arrests were the two measures that I used. There are about 1,400 census tracts in Massachusetts, and that kind of is the main sort of source of, that's the main unit of analysis for the study, although I do look at cities and counties and other data. I use the census tract because research has found that the scale of the neighborhood is best for estimating relationships between racial composition and crime in prior studies. And so I think a lot about scale and what is the right scale for thinking about contextual levels of incarceration, and also sort of what does it mean to be a neighborhood? Of course, this is an imperfect measure. Ideally, we would know how people perceive their neighborhood boundaries, but we use the census tract. To give some context to Massachusetts, I use the wonderful data set provided by the Vera Institute of Justice called the Incarceration Trends data set, and this is at the county level. They provide annual county level prison admissions data for US counties, beginning, I believe, in the late 1980s is when the data become clean enough to analyze. All right, so some findings. I'm going to begin with talking about the research I've done on sort of identifying and analyzing pervasive incarceration. And the first thing I want to say is I'm definitely not focusing on the first big finding of the book where the spatial pattern has really diffused. But I think that diffusion has led to scholars thinking that race is mattering less for mass incarceration, that there are majority white communities now that are being incarcerated at very high levels, and that race is less and less an important feature. But I actually find that even in this sort of late stage of mass imprisonment in the US, where we're seeing declining prison admissions, we're seeing declining, very large declines in some states, that communities of pervasive incarceration are still very, very profound and can be found in a diverse set of places. So if we look beyond the big city, we can actually find these communities of pervasive incarceration in smaller counties and places beyond the large metropolitan areas that our research has really focused on. So I'm going to share with you, just take you through some cities that, unless you're from Massachusetts, you've probably never heard of. And even if you're from Massachusetts, you may have never heard of them. But part of my work is to care more about small cities that people tend to sort of think of. I mean, MIT had a symposium literally calling these places forgotten cities. So it's part of my work is to put these cities on everybody's radar. But first, of course, I'll start with Boston. And I just want to sort of demonstrate via map just how different the experience of incarceration is by race in terms of spatiality. So, there are very large pockets of white concentration all over this area, but you can see that white people almost never live in a community where incarceration is very spatially clustered. Unlike our Black population, where there's just a fundamental spatial clustering of incarceration within 3 neighborhoods of Boston. Latinos actually live in a lot of different places throughout the state, and their concentration is, a bit sort of higher than you see in this map of the white population. So this is 3 maps of the same geographic area, but mapping the race of the person who is admitted to prison onto that same geographic area. So this is Springfield, and it's up at the top left where you see this concentration among Latinos is its suburb Holyoke. And these are in Western Massachusetts. They sit just north of the Connecticut border. Springfield was actually the main location of Tim Black's book, When a Heart Turns Rock Solid. It's a wonderful, multiple, like I think over spanning decades, ethnography of drug use and criminalization in this small city. And in the book, it describes the loss of manufacturing jobs, characteristic of these sort of forgotten cities of Massachusetts. And Black notes that this intense racial and ethnic segregation was happening with an all-white political leadership, and they just were not addressing, and to this day are not addressing, the deprivation found within the largely Puerto Rican neighborhoods found in Springfield. And Holyoke to the north, as you can see, it was once called the Paper City. These cities were very large manufacturing cities in the early part of the 20th century, saw the closure of all of its manufacturing industry, and Holyoke to this day still has seen very little economic development. It faces enormous fiscal challenges and has few public resources. For example, there's no homeless shelter in Holyoke, despite a massive problem with homelessness and opioid use in the city. And again, you can kind of see that in general, when you map this data, we don't see a spatial concentration among white population. We see an intense concentration among the Black population, and another sort of intensive, even more so than we saw in Boston, a concentration among the Latino population. So Lowell and Lawrence are 2 cities to the north of Boston. Lowell's also had a very large industry, in particular the textile industry, which collapsed in the mid 20th century, and the city just simply never fully recovered. If you go to Lowell, there are these huge mills that are in the center of the city. Some have been redeveloped as companies have started to put their businesses in more affordable small cities. Others have been left abandoned. The city's middle class fled, and the decline in population and revenue streams led to significant decline in the social infrastructure provided to its residents. And again, you can sort of see that in this area, and if we didn't think about small cities, we might say, oh, Latinos don't really live in concentrated incarceration. But if you go to these small cities, you can see that actually, in fact, there is a deep concentration among Latinos in these smaller places. So looking outside of the big city is really important, especially for, say, immigrants who are moving to new destinations or places that have become enclaves for, Puerto Rican migrants to the mainland US. So there's one city that is actually the exception, not the rule. And Fall River is one exception worth noting. Fall River has some of the highest opioid-related overdose deaths in the country. In a city with a population of about 90,000, 64 people died of overdose in the last year, which is by comparison to Boston, with a city of 680,000, experienced 190 deaths. So it's a massive rate. In fact, the highest rate of opioid-related deaths in the state. It also has a very high crime rate, and poverty is twice the state average. And actually, whites do, in fact, in this city live in sort of concentrated incarceration. But this is really the exception, not the rule. I looked at this, both in absolute numbers and rates. Small cities and suburbs have the highest rates of incarceration in the sample. And by looking at all places, we also know that there are huge parts of the state where there's no incarceration, especially among the white sample. So by looking just at cities, we've actually cut the distribution off, both at the low end and at the high end. We've missed the highest rates. We also missed the lowest rates. And so I just want to share that in this slide, what I'm looking at is what where did people live prior to their incarceration? And were they living in sort of the top, like highest rates of incarceration or in the state, or the lowest? And so you can sort of see that even as a white person going into incarceration, almost half, about 42%, are living in areas that have very low incarceration. They might be just sort of the only person or one of a few that went to prison. And only 11 or 13% of people of color are living in those kinds of low incarceration areas. On the other side of the distribution, only 5% of white people are being incarcerated in places that are in those very high pervasive punishment places, whereas a quarter of people are living, of people of color are living in those top high incarceration areas. So you can think about this as similarly to what William Julius Wilson's talking about, where, you know, even white poverty itself is just so characteristically different from the poverty experienced in Black neighborhoods, where poverty is so much more concentrated and pervasive. It's the same, I see a very similar pattern for punishment. Another way I sort of look at this is just the distribution of arrest rates within Black, Latino, and white neighborhoods. And so the takeaway from this slide is that the median prison admission rate of white neighborhoods is about 1/3 the minimum rate for Black neighborhoods. Only outliers in the white neighborhoods track the distribution of Black and Latino neighborhoods. Black neighborhoods saw in Massachusetts a minimum of 20 prison admissions, and 71 white neighborhoods saw 0 admissions in 9 years. So there's just this massive racial spatial difference. Another way I think about this is disproportionality. And I just conduct a very, very simple fraction because I think it's just, you know, I could apply a lot of statistics to this, but I think it's just easier to think about this in terms of the sort of way we characterize disparity at the state level. And it's just the percentage of people in a particular racial group at a particular event divided by the percentage of that same racial group in the overall population. So if 10% of the population in that area is incarcerated and they're 10% of the population overall, we would say that's proportional representation. However, if they're 50% of the incarcerated population, but just 10% of the overall, we'd say that's an overrepresentation. So I calculate this at all different scales, at the census tract level and the county level. A ratio of 1-to-1 would suggest a system that imprisons people independently of race. And so what I've done is I've plotted disproportionality among Black people against white disproportionality in each census tract. And what I find is that the 90th percentile of Black disproportionality is 30 times the 90th percentile for white disproportionality. The disproportionality is thus really a fundamental reality for Black and Latino residents in Massachusetts. This is the same plot of Latinos. So for whites, disproportionality, meaning that they're overrepresented in the prison population, is just a rare exception, even in a statewide analysis. The median level of disproportionality for Black people is 14. So that, going back to that slide, it's 14 times their population. That's the median. And that's 12 times the 90th percentile for whites. So going back to this, the median for Black people is 14 in terms of overrepresentation. And that's 12 times the 90th percentile of disproportionality among whites. Now, as you might recall, Massachusetts has the highest rate of sort of disproportionality among Latinos. It has a very high rate of disproportionality compared to national levels, compared to the US, or the overall US. I'm just going to skip this because I've said that already. So I look at this already. I look at this using the Vera Institute of Justice data. And here's the distribution, and I'm just going to zoom in because, as you can see, there are so many outliers among Black people. And so these graphs reveal a very startling national trend in county level racial disproportionality. And I find that across all regions, West, Northeast, the South, the West, and the Midwest, and also for all county urbanicity types, large urban, small, sort of urban, suburban, and rural, racial disproportionality is extraordinarily high among Black populations. And what I find is that on average, and accepting outliers, white populations are never overrepresented in prison populations, and Black populations are never underrepresented in prison admissions. Out of 3,000 counties, over 3,000 counties, there are 3 counties in the United States where white imprisonment is overrepresented in relation to white population by a factor of 2 or more. So they're being incarcerated twice how much they're represented in the overall population. I find 80 counties where Latinos are imprisoned 2 times or more their population share. There are 1,200 counties where imprisonment among Black Americans is 2 times or more their population share. So the differences are in terms of the experience of disproportionality is just so stark. And kind of going back to Peterson and Crivo and Bill Wilson, it's hard to think about comparison groups. If there's only 3 counties where whites are overrepresented, in the way that 1,200 counties, nearly half of counties in the US, are where there's Black overrepresentation, how do we even begin to compare the experience of punishment? In some ways, it becomes arguably a fundamental feature of Black life in a way that we could not imagine experienced among whites. So I have about 5 minutes left. I realize that I am almost going over time, so I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly. So I mentioned that one of the ways that I try to kind of move our research forward is to not shy away from normative commitments and ask, how can our normative commitments actually become sort of become at the center of our empirical analysis? If we state them up front and we try to sort of say, actually, we could measure that. We could think of a way to actually directly measure our value deficits through quantitative analysis and sort of being very upfront about our normative commitments. I think that's a step forward, rather than sort of say, we are value neutral. We're just going to report these statistics, and then you can kind of, the policy and philosophy folks can kind of deal with the normative part of it. I'm really interested in integrating these and being explicit. And so our scholars have kind of talked about this and tried to do that implicitly in the punishment literature by talking about how there is lifetime exclusion from political institutions, that our public investments in criminal justice outsize our civic infrastructure. Those are sort of normative commitments to political membership, to how we should be using our resources as this country, and that we should, the invisibility of men going to prison has obscured even our statistical portrait of American inequality. And that, to me, implies that they should be included, that inclusion is a normative commitment we might have. So one of the ways I think about incarceration is not just the end point of a criminal justice adjudication, but actually a loss. It's a chronic, and communities experience chronic and long-term exposure to loss due to incarceration. And the way that I do this is by actually not just measuring the total number of people, but actually the total years that those people were sentenced. You could think about this in public health research, looking at measures of premature death. You could think about this in terms of, sort of like, I think that's really where I'm inspired to kind of bring in the idea that, well, we don't want premature death. You could think of incarceration as a social death. And we sum that across a geographic area. And this is developed from an idea of the relationship between loss and stress and how that might emerge at the community level. And sort of drawing from the literature on loss and how this might map onto geography, that a whole group might be more vulnerable to loss based on where they live and how their community has been affected by incarceration. So what's interesting about this slide is this is not just a map of people going to prison in the state of Massachusetts, but the total number of years that people were sentenced to prison per every 10,000 inhabitants. And if I showed you a map like this of prison admissions, there would be many more sort of dark Black cities. This is at the city level. But community loss is even more concentrated than prison admissions itself. So there are places, in fact, a lot of very punitive prosecutors who are opposing criminal justice reform in Massachusetts are the leaders that are found in these very dark areas where community loss is highest. So very punitive sort of court systems. We can imagine more punitive police departments. And how this sort of accumulates all the way to levels of loss at the community level. So Massachusetts, lowest incarceration rate in the country, sentenced people to 127,000 years during the height of mass incarceration. So between 97 and 2009, which is when I have the best data on sentencing. Boston alone lost 487 years for every 10,000 residents, a total of 29,000 years. Small cities on average lost between 600 and 1,000 years for every 10,000 residents. 8 cities covering about 20% of Massachusetts population accounted for over 50% of its community loss. I can look at this at the neighborhood level as well. I just want to point out that here there's a neighborhood that lost, this is just an absolute count, 1,000 years just between the later years of my data, 2009 to 2017. One neighborhood, 1,000 years of sentencing to prison in the lowest incarceration rate state in the country. And this is plotting the loss against the total Black population. And there's definitely a correlation here. There's a correlation to the Latino population as well. This was a majority Latino population that has this 1,000 years lost. So, of course, much like our demographic research would suggest, but I think it's, a subtle but important difference is Black and Latino neighborhoods in Massachusetts experience the greatest levels of community loss. And there are neighborhoods with no community loss at all, and they're at least 50% white and on average 82% white. So in my summary here is that incarceration is fundamentally, at least especially at the prison, imprisonment is fundamentally segregative. It changes the composition and membership of communities and neighborhoods. It interrupts community bonds and connections to place. And in the context of mass incarceration, people are going away on average for 5 years and can be gone for several decades. So community loss is a way to reframe how we think about community level impacts of incarceration and kind of move away from the kind of inherent blaming that the punishment institution is conferring. So I am 2 minutes over. I was hoping to just quickly wrap up. I'm so sorry to go so long. The summary is just that racial residential segregation underlies the demographic concentration of punishment, though I argue it's rarely theorized or studied as an important driver of racial disparities in punishment. Monica Bell, who is a professor at Yale Law School, has argued in a paper, Anti-Segregation Policing, that criminal justice, and in particular policing, actually reinforces segregation. So not only does segregation produce criminal justice contact, but it also is reinforcing it and reestablishing it. Mass imprisonment, I argue, affected communities broadly, and that in order for us to understand both the advantages and disadvantages of punishment, we have to study more places than just large cities. And mass imprisonment will have long-term effects on the quality of membership and the health of communities in American society, even as prison admissions have declined in some places. I hope that we can start to move away from just characterizing mass incarceration and its disparities using national or state level measures and really bring to light the lived experience of mass imprisonment in communities and among community members. It's important to have granularity, being able to look down into neighborhoods, but also this broad spatial approach. We should explore measures more so. I kind of present 3 vignettes of 3 types of measures, but I think we could actually start to explore more how to use our normative commitments within our empirical analyses and test the values that we have that underline our policy conversations and advocacy efforts. I think that these have policy implications for how we think about intervening on the criminal legal system. Just changing somebody's mind about how they think about race might not have implications for the larger structural barriers that people face prior to even being arrested. And yeah, just sort of how we think about eliminating bias in the system might, avoid all these other larger questions about where racial disparity is emergent in the system. And I want to make a plug for small cities and looking at small cities and caring about small cities and thinking about what percentage of our countries actually live in these smaller communities and how large cities don't really cannot stand in or speak for other experiences of place, and how a spatial perspective can explain a lot about what's happening in incarceration today. And then sort of going forward from this sort of community loss perspective, my work is starting to think more about how imprisonment reproduces segregation and disparities in health. And so those are sort of my next projects, looking at how community loss might be able to be studied as opposed to just imprisonment as a driver of health and health disparity. Thank you so much. My sincere apologies for going 5 minutes over. I really look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I think we all forgive you for going a few minutes over because it was such a great talk, so clear, such a lot of information in there, but some really quite stark messages, I think, for particularly for policymakers, politicians, legislators, for example. I don't